It's really an honor to be here with you tonight to discuss removing labels, the Jewish perspective. Let's start by removing labels. The Jewish perspective. Well, the thing is, there isn't a Jewish perspective. There isn't one Jewish perspective. To coin a phrase, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, which coincidentally is the title of a letter to the editor that I submitted to the Jewish Journal on March 25th in response to the article, 3 UC student governments endorse BDS, published in that week's edition, about UCR and UCSD's student senates being the 2nd and 3rd to have voted to approve resolutions urging their campus administrations and the UC as a whole to divest from companies which either assist or profit from the Israeli occupation. Believe it or not, my letter was published in this week's edition. In it, I commended the author for covering the story of the first 3 UC governments to vote for divestment. I also commended him for including the voices and perspectives of Palestinian students and SJP activists in his story. And while he included the voices of Jewish students and activists who opposed these measures, my letter pointed out that he completely left out the voices of the many Jewish activists, both on and off campuses, who promote the nonviolent BDS movement and the rights of Palestinians to equality, justice, and self-determination in their homeland. So, the Jewish perspective. Wait a minute, we're removing labels, right? Great. How about my perspective? I am Jewish. My father's parents fled the horrors for Jews that were spreading through the Ukraine in the mid-1920s with their 3 children. Some in their large families sought freedom in America, but my grandfather took his family to Palestine, which I'm told they referred to as Israel, even back then. It was there that their family grew to 7 kids, my father being the last. My mother's parents met in New York. Both were immigrants. My grandmother was Jewish from Lithuania, and she and her many siblings were orphaned and sent together in America when she was quite young. My Sicilian grandfather was Catholic. Rumor has it that they met at a concert in Central Park. She dropped a glove, he picked it up for her. But my perspective starts with me. It starts having grown up in a basically secular home in Southern California and finding my way through the world, through my experiences, through the books I read, the movies I saw, TV shows my family watched, and people I met. My perspective starts by continually challenging, allowing, and permitting myself to look at the world through new eyes. By listening to other perspectives, other narratives, other viewpoints and understandings. I'm quite sure that my role of always considering the viewpoint of the other, the accused, the oppressed, the marginalized, and discriminated against, is a perspective that I, as a Jew, cannot turn away from. Perhaps because of the Holocaust. It's that legacy that left me no choice but to become a solidarity activist upon learning about the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. I actually remember the day that I realized, after learning over the course of a year, that even as a well-informed adult, fairly obsessed with news and current events, that much, if not most, of what I had been told, read, heard on the news, and believed about my father's homeland of Israel and its history was wrong. And once I became aware of the facts, of the history, I simply could not make the choice to do nothing. I couldn't just stand by silently and rest while someone else suffered, this time. I believe that Jews and Israelis would benefit greatly by looking at BDS through new eyes. I would suggest that they look at BDS through the eyes of Noam Shazaf, the co-founder and manager of 972, an English language web magazine that provides an outlet for a group of Israeli bloggers opposed to the occupation and critical of other aspects of Israeli society and Israeli policies. Noam points out that there is both what is to be done and what is not to be done in regards to BDS. He writes, "The question of what should be done now is less clear than at any other moment that we've experienced. He believes that the first clear thing is what not to do. And he thinks not to cooperate with anything that can help sustain the current status quo is very important. For Jews and Israelis, there are a whole variety of actions which sustain the status quo, and they need to become conscious of that. Noam suggests that Israelis and Jews not oppose Palestinian opposition to the occupation. I know it's a clear thing in this room, but in most Israeli and Jewish venues, it needs to be said that Jews and Israelis should not, even if they don't find their home in BDS or in other particular activities, they should not oppose them. This is his message. When he's asked about the BDS movement, he says that it obviously is not something that the established Jewish community can digest right now, but it needs to realize that it cannot go on opposing Palestinian resistance, especially Palestinian unarmed resistance, civil society resistance. I too think that this is an argument that should and needs to be made with all of our friends, whoever they may be. My perspective is all about nonviolence. I believe that nonviolence is Jewish, and Christian, and Muslim, and feminist. You get the point. My introduction to this movement really began in 2008 with some very challenging experiences in Jewish communities, homes, and conversations as an organizer with the Obama for America campaign. Then, subsequently, meeting some activists with a pro-Israel, pro-peace organization at the Democratic National Convention. The intersection of American politics, democratic politics, Israeli and Jewish politics, and lobbies had hit my radar screen for the first time. Then came the spring of 2010, when I started reading about the student government at UC Berkeley, voting over whether or not to divest from two companies which directly profit off Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands. I'm reading about this and I'm thinking, fantastic, right? Disrupt violence with nonviolence? Boycotts and divestment, these were things I knew about. These were the tools used by my heroes, by Gandhi, Dr. King, President Mandela, and Cesar Chavez. Boycotts. What could be more Jewish? Do not profit from the blood of your neighbor. Whoever is able to protest the wrongdoings of their community and doesn't, it is as if they themselves did it and are punished for it. And of course, justice, justice shall you pursue. These are famous quotes from Jewish texts. Right? What? No? No. I was truly shocked when I got an email from my cool Jewish peace organization explaining that they opposed the bill before the Berkeley Student Senate and supported the veto of the Student Senate president. Seriously? I understood even then that the BDS movement is a Palestinian call. Nonetheless, BDS spoke to me, and it also speaks to some of the best strains from within Jewish tradition. The lesson of never again is a reminder that in the face of extreme horror, it is incumbent upon people of conscience to rally around the inalienable rights of the abused. So I'm reading about calls for fairness for all sides, which proclaim that fairness consisted of the promotion of a particular political outcome, a two-state solution, but not an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. My perspective, that's a funny kind of fairness. In a 2010 case study from the Jewish Community Relations Council titled Combating Anti-Israel Divestment Resolutions on Campus, suggested that anti-BDS activists should combat divestment campaigns on the grounds that they are anti-peace. And if the response you get is that BDS is a legitimate form of nonviolent resistance, how can you call that anti-peace? Then you should respond with nonviolence and peace are not synonymous. BDS supporters may be utilizing nonviolent tactics, but they're not advocating for a peaceful two-state resolution that recognizes the legitimate rights of both parties, as if the only pro-peace position are those same two unequal states. Don't try to reconstruct the bill, the talking points read. Instead, focus on how it is an attack on the Jewish community. Of course, others have taken their accusations from the nonsensical to the morally despicable. In her presentation at Brooklyn College this past February, Judith Butler spoke about the importance of the BDS movement this way. If the Jew who struggles for justice in Palestine is considered to be anti-Semitic, if any number of internationals who have joined this struggle from various parts of the world are also considered anti-Semitic, and if Palestinians seeking rights of political self-determination are so accused as well, then it would appear that if no oppositional move can take place without risking the accusation of anti-Semitism, that accusation becomes a way of discrediting a bid for self-determination, at which point we have to ask, what political purpose the radical misuse of that accusation has assumed in the stifling of a movement for self-determination? Personally, I have to wonder how the Jews who organized many boycotts of the past would think about BDS being characterized as anti-Semitic. Rafael Megarek, in his post, A Nice Jewish Boycott, on the Open Zion blog, actually lays out the hypocrisy to the claim that BDS is anti-Semitic, using the example of his own boycott as an Orthodox Jew of some Orthodox establishments because of their labor practices or lack of access for the disabled. So my perspective includes not only finding myself for the first time part of a Jewish community which reflects my values and ideals and interests in social justice, as Jewish Voice for Peace does, but also finding friendship in a community that shares those values walk side by side with us in the struggle as Students for Justice in Palestine does. There's something about SJP that's not as true for Jewish Voice for Peace. It's not as true for our young adult wing, Young Jewish and Proud. It's not true about Muslim Student Union, J Street, or American Muslims for Palestine. All fine organizations, and most of whom we partner with. But SJP, on its face, includes everyone. Students for Justice in Palestine are students who believe in justice, including Palestine. You're students who believe in justice everywhere. That's what binds you. Not because you're Jewish or Muslim, not because you're of any particular heritage. And for me, there's something beautifully all-American and inclusive about that. SJP is for everyone. SJP sets an example for democracy by including everyone. Any student, faculty member, or staff member who believes in human rights, civil rights, and the right to self-determination can find a home at SJP. Anyone that understands that the catastrophe of the Zionist project and the founding of Israel had on the indigenous people of Palestine can find a home at SJP. Anyone who knows that the American governmental and institutional support for Israel's occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the siege of Gaza is a stain and a shame on and of our nation can find a home at SJP. Anyone who knows that the American media is a continuing source of misinformation and is directly responsible for widespread misunderstandings about the situation in Palestine and Israel among Americans today can find a home at SJP. It's this inclusivity, the diversity of SJP that gives you your beauty, strength, and power. It's that you are the very image of what we all strive for the world to be that makes SJP so special. From my perspective, SJP has already proven why they're important. After its founding in 2001, the first SJP chapter at UC Berkeley came to international attention in April of 2002 when they chose the memorial of the Deir Yassin massacre to occupy a campus building and disrupt a midterm for over 600 students. This was done as part of a protest against their university's investments in Israel. After warning the students of trespassing, the occupation was broken up by police. 79 protesters were arrested, cited for trespassing, and in some cases, for resisting arrest. Following the arrests, SJP was banned from operating at UCLA, which then prompted SJP to begin a campaign against what they saw as the university attacking freedom of speech, assembly, and protest. And the following month, over 200 demonstrators turned out for a national day of action called Free Palestine, Free Speech, to protest what they saw as the university's stifling of freedom of thought and protest, as well as the university's continuing links with Israel. By 2005, support for Palestinian rights had grown beyond students and faith-based activists into an international movement, in part due to the passage of the landmark Palestinian civil society call for worldwide support of BDS. BDS had become the dominant form of organizing for Palestinian solidarity activists worldwide. But SJP was there first. In 2009, Hampshire College became the first college in the nation to divest from companies on the grounds of their involvement in the Israeli occupation. This historic move was a direct result of a 2-year intensive campaign by Hampshire College SJP. The group pressured Hampshire College's Board of Trustees to divest from 6 companies due to human rights concerns in occupied Palestine. More than 800 students, professors, and alumni signed SJP's institutional statement calling for divestment. Meeting minutes from a committee of Hampshire's Board of Trustees confirmed that President Hexter acknowledged it was the good work of SJP that brought this issue to the attention of the committee. This groundbreaking decision continued in Hampshire College's history. They were, after all, the first college in the country to divest from apartheid South Africa 32 years before that. In 2010, 60 SJP chapters and allied student groups united to compose and disseminate a statement in response to the Anti-Defamation League's designation of SJP as one of the top 10 anti-Israel groups in America, a list which also included a certain national Jewish organization, which today numbers over 125,000 followers, Jewish Voice for Peace. In 2010, another important event occurred which involved students who belonged to 2 SJP chapters, along with organizers from the Muslim Student Union and American Muslims for Palestine. And this is where my path would first cross with SJP. As the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, gave a political speech to an audience of community members and students at UC Irvine, he was repeatedly interrupted by a student-organized, nonviolent demonstration. One by one, 10 students stood and shouted prepared statements at Oren, the American-born Israeli ambassador to America, who had served multiple tours in the Israeli army, including during the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Those 10 students, along with one other who was grabbed by police during a pre-planned walkout of the event, were taken to a room prepared in advance of the event by police and arrested on site. The demonstration was not intended to be a surprise. In fact, in advance of the event, the members of UCI MSU issued a statement which began, "The members of the Muslim Student Union at the University of California, Irvine condemn and strongly oppose the presence of Michael Oren on our campus today. We resent that the law school and political science department have agreed to co-sponsor a public figure who represents a state that continues to commit human rights violations, thereby breaking international law and law of Israeli accord. We strongly condemn the university for co-sponsoring and therefore inadvertently supporting the ambassador of a state that is condemned by more UN Human Rights Council resolutions than all other countries in the world combined." Protests were not unusual at UC Irvine or at most any other college or university campus. In fact, that protest happened on the same day which students at Oxford University disrupted a speech given by Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister Danny Ayalon. More importantly, similar demonstrations of Israeli officials' speeches had occurred in the past and continue to this day. What was historic about that day at UCI was the pre-event decision that regardless of anybody breaking any law, any and all protesters of Michael Oren would be arrested. And because of that decision, on that day, the Irvine 11 were born. It was 1 year later, on the very last day, that it would be legally possible that the Orange County DA charged the 8 UC Irvine and 3 UC Riverside students with conspiring to disrupt the speech by Michael Oren at UCI. Less than 1 week later, young Jewish and Proud activist Rachel Roberts and I hand-delivered to the Orange County DA's office petitions collected by JVP in less than 4 days, listing the signatures of over 5,000 people, telling the Orange County DA to charge us too. The 5,000 of us who signed were confessing to our crimes of interrupting for human rights because we too had interrupted speakers at events to make a political point. We also delivered a letter from more than a dozen rabbis from around the country condemning the prosecution of the Muslim students. Among other things, the letter pointed out the clear double standards for protests in America. When JVP delivered those petitions and messages of support, we were joining, among others, the Los Angeles Times editorial board, and later, 100 UC Irvine faculty members, including 14 chancellors, professors, and distinguished professors, and the founding dean of UCI School of Law, in calling for those charges to be dropped. This was, by the way, in sharp contrast to the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the American Jewish Committee, who amazingly, publicly supported the criminal charges. As many of you are probably aware, JVP activists engaged in a very similar protest in the past and without being charged, including a speech by the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, in November of 2010 in New Orleans. On live TV, all around the world, and to my knowledge, not one of us has faced criminal charges. When the judge in the Irvine 11 case placed a gag order on all involved, I was proud to join with community leaders, including those from the Christian and Muslim communities, to speak on behalf of those brave student activists while they could not speak for themselves. The work that SJP and JVP shares in, and the bonds that have formed as a result, continue to grow. Last fall, JVP issued a strongly worded statement condemning the California Assembly's hasty H.R. 35, which was presented to be a broad condemnation of anti-Semitism on UC campuses, but which actually goes far, far beyond that by putting limits on the free speech of students, faculty, and community members who criticize Israeli government policies. This resolution wants the UC system to treat Israel differently from virtually every other country in the world, including the United States, by claiming that much of the criticism of Israeli government policies is hate speech. Imagine if any legislator tried to introduce a similar resolution claiming that criticism of Iran is anti-Muslim, or that attacks on Utah's strict anti-choice laws are somehow anti-Mormon. Immediately, the UC Student Association, a coalition of UC student governments across each campus, reacted by expressing its principled opposition to anti-Semitism, but deep concern with the language of H.R. 35. Likewise, civil rights groups and faculty members recognized the serious threat such a definition of anti-Semitism poses to the free speech and academic speech on our campuses. And through its vote, it's clear that the UC Student Association did as well. It's no secret that it was fantastic SJP members statewide, along with supporters, who organized a strong coalition of student activists to make that happen. This is a fight that continues today and should have our full attention. To wage a defense of these efforts to erode, dismantle, or paralyze the free speech rights for students and activists on California campuses who advocate for Palestinian rights, all justice organizations need to expand the kind of broad coalition building SJP is known for. My perspective includes acknowledging that setbacks are often opportunities. And it would seem that my perspective aligns with that of the Jews who participated in the Freedom Rides and the March for Voting Rights from Selma to Montgomery back in the 1960s. On March 7, 1965, 600 civil rights marchers got only as far as the Edmund Pettus Bridge, just 6 blocks from where they started, before they were met by state and local lawmen who attacked them with billy clubs and tear gas. But those activists would not be deterred. And more importantly, or equally importantly, nor would reporters and photographers who had traveled south to make sure that this movement gained the public knowledge and attention it needed to succeed. They spread far and wide the stories and images of what they saw that day. And 2 weeks later, 3,200 marchers set out for Montgomery. And by the time they reached it 4 days later, there were 25,000 marching with them. In our struggle, dogs and billy clubs seem to have been replaced with stand with us talking points and threatening scenarios about how student senators' votes could affect the future of their academic and professional careers. And like it was for the civil rights marchers of the 60s, sunlight can be used to change the balance of power. Activists must play a role in making sure that the whole story of what has happened on this campus over the course of the past several weeks gets investigated and widely reported on, especially if, as was the case in Berkeley, intimidation was involved. Unlike the 60s, we live in a time when not only do we have the tools, but you know how to make news. Your generation is the information and communication generation that will change this world using the disinfectant of sunlight. You already have. First Berkeley, now Riverside. Okay, spoiler alert. I see a frightening pattern forming, and I predict that we have not seen the last of these tactics used by our opposition for the last time. We can't control with those who choose to support a history of oppression, segregation, and a system of apartheid that I am sure they would appall if the roles were reversed, do and say. But what we can control is our light. As President Lincoln said, I am not bound to win, but I am bound to be true. I am not bound to succeed, but I am bound to live by the light that I have. I challenge us all to use our light to illuminate the stories of who, when, why, and how student senators are being persuaded to reverse their carefully considered votes for divestment. According to Armando Saldana, the Associated Students Executive Vice President, as quoted in an LA Times story last week, the student leaders moved to drop the controversial divestment policy after approving it just a month ago because they came to see how it made Jewish students feel marginalized. The implication is that Jewish students feel marginalized by challenges to segregation, apartheid, and injustice. What does that say about their Jewish perspective? By way of comparison, how would the UC Riverside student government have responded in the 1980s to claims that white students might feel marginalized by a boycott of South Africa? Remember those talking points? They read, focus on how it is an attack on the Jewish community. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, in a landmark case on Israel and Jewish identity, a British court found that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. The tribunal wrote in its judgment that a belief in the Zionist project or an attachment to Israel or any similar sentiment cannot amount to a protected characteristic. It is not intrinsically a part of Jewishness. My perspective is that our fate is in our own hands to shape the reality of our future. Despite efforts to exclude us from discussions and decisions and conversations about Israel, Palestine, war, peace, what might achieve it, we're part of the global community, and we will remain part of the conversation. We will continue raising our collective voice by growing our just movement. My perspective is that our tax dollars should not continue to pour into the Israeli military by the billions under the guise that it provides security. It certainly does not provide security for Palestinians. Citizens of Israel are not. I don't believe it provides a real or lasting security to Israel either. Those bullets and bombs don't provide security. They won't ever provide security. They cannot provide security for some. They cannot provide security for the lives of some while tearing apart and distinguishing the lives of others. All those weapons can provide is prolonging the pain, anguish, suffering, and destruction of people's lives. Attempts are made to silence us by the PA, in the Jewish community, in the media, and in our Congress. But we continue to show up with our messages of peace through nonviolence. As we Jewish activists continue our individual and collective practices of tikkun olam, repairing the world, we seek not only to help oppressed Palestinians in Israel, occupied Palestinians, and Palestinian refugees whose hearts, I would imagine, feel occupied, wherever they may be in the world, but also our own families, communities, and our friends in Israel. Whether in support or practice, by denying basic human rights to others, we injure and threaten our own rights. In denying others the right to live in peace and security in their homeland, Israel damages her claim of desiring the same. Many of us are pained when we hear the calls for balance in this conversation come not from the oppressed, but from the strong and powerful oppressor. In spite of their very powerful position, often they don't speak as the powerful. Often they speak as victims. It's not enough to speak about social justice and equality. When one is privileged with power, we are also burdened with responsibility to help those without it. Many in Israel have stoked the understandable fears of many who lived through the Nazi regime. But creating a sense of eternal victimhood allows Israelis to live in a state of denial about how much violence they use on a daily basis against Palestinians. Bombing innocent men, women, and children in Gaza will never make my family and Israel safer. Israel exists as a strong and powerful state. That is a fact. Israel could make the choice to offer a real peace, a real and viable Palestinian state based on mutual benefit and requiring mutual cooperation. But Israel continues to hunker down in a defensive and aggressive posture. Instead of offering a hand in peace to help those who continue to live in extremely difficult conditions at their hands and helping them build a future which would benefit everyone. My perspective includes the aspirations of safety, justice, security in our homes, schools, and communities, access to an education, good jobs, a ladder to climb to our futures, the right to walk anywhere without being called names, spat at, harassed, excluded, beaten, oppressed, not because of our gender, race, religion, or our sexual orientation. Isn't that what all people aspire for? Why should Palestinians refrain from demanding the same for themselves? Identification with those in distress is often perceived as a sign of weakness. Concern for the rights of the other, for people who are not exactly like you, may strike some as soft or naive. I offer that it's actually a sign of great strength. We are often called bleeding hearts or accused of self-hatred or worse. In the Jewish community, any criticism of Israel is received by some as an act of treason. In fact, less than 4 months after we launched JBPLA, I would wake up to find on my front porch of my home a wanted poster accusing me of treason and incitement against Jews, of numerous acts of fomenting hatred against the Jewish people and the state of Israel, while conspiring with other well-known anti-Israel groups to engender hatred and incite further violence against the Jewish people and the Jewish state of Israel. Of course, they forgot to include by whom I am accused of such crimes, or explain the link between talking to groups like yours and teaching about BDS and inciting violence. The irony is that the opposite is obviously true. If I didn't care, I'd work on a different cause. If we really did not care, we would not continue to identify with this particular struggle. Our passion comes from a desire to make our homes, families, and communities the best that they could be. And for many of us, Israel is part of those. The majority of my own family lives in Israel. Of course, their safety and peace of mind and futures are important to me. I wish for them the ability to embrace the differences of others and to celebrate their uniquenesses and similarities. I hope that one day they will live in peace not only with others, but with themselves. Only when we all embrace the other and allow all to rise and